She's a whale. She's disgusting. Her own sister screamed it without shame as their cowardly father offered his plus-sized accountant daughter to a terrifying mafia kingpin to settle a $4 million stolen debt. The arrogant family was completely convinced they could effortlessly discard Clara as a worthless punishment. They had no idea the monster was already captivated by her brilliance. And they had absolutely no idea this underestimated woman was about to become his queen. The air inside the cramped back office of Higgins Logistics smelled of stale cigar smoke and suffocating fear. Clara Higgins sat rigidly behind her battered metal desk, fingers trembling over the keys of her calculator. At 24, Clara was used to making herself small, a nearly impossible feat, given her size. She was a plus-sized woman in a family that worshipped razor-sharp collarbones and zero-calorie diets. For years, she had buried herself beneath oversized beige knit sweaters and the heavy ledgers of her father's failing company, accepting her role as the invisible, undesirable workhorse of the Higgins family without complaint. But today, invisibility was impossible. Standing on the other side of the frosted glass door was Dante Rossetti. Dante was the undisputed head of the Chicago Rossetti Syndicate, a man whose name was whispered with a potent mixture of terror and reverence. 34 years old. Built like a heavyweight fighter wrapped in $3,000 Italian wool, with eyes the color of shattered ice. The underworld knew two unshakable facts about Dante Rossetti. He never forgave a debt. And he would never produce an heir. A decade earlier, a brutal torture session at the hands of the rival Calabrese family had left him medically and undeniably sterile. The leaked medical records had caused a temporary fracture in the Mafia hierarchy, but Dante had cemented his absolute power through sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness. He didn't need a bloodline to rule. He only needed fear. And Clara's father, Arthur Higgins, had just stolen $4 million from him. The office door rattled open. Arthur stumbled backward into the room, his face slick with terrified sweat. Behind him, Dante strode in, flanked by two towering enforcers. His gaze swept the room with predatory slowness, dismissing the peeling wallpaper and cheap filing cabinets before landing on Arthur like a verdict. "The money is gone, Arthur." Dante's voice was a low, gravelly hum that vibrated in Clara's chest. "Laundered through offshore accounts my men have already seized. But you still owe me the principal plus interest." "Mr. Rossetti, please," Arthur begged, his knees hitting the linoleum floor audibly. "I have assets. I have my home. The warehouse." "Worthless," Dante interrupted smoothly. "But I hear you have a daughter. A beautiful girl. Savannah." Clara flinched, instinctively pulling her cardigan tighter around her broad shoulders. "Of course. Savannah." Savannah, her younger sister, was Arthur's golden child. A platinum blonde pageant queen whose Instagram-perfect life had been funded by the very money Arthur had stolen. "Yes." Arthur gasped, desperately. "Savannah, she's gorgeous. 21. Flawless. You can have her. Marry her. Take her. Whatever you want. She'll be a perfect trophy for you, Don Rossetti." Dante's ice-blue eyes drifted away from the groveling man. They bypassed the doorway and finally settled in the dark corner of the room. Locking onto Clara. She froze like cornered prey. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, acutely aware of how she must look to a man like him. A frizzy-haired girl with ink stains on her fingers, shrinking behind a metal desk. "Who is that?" Dante asked, his tone suddenly sharp. Arthur blinked, confused, before turning to look at Clara. Disgust momentarily overpowered his fear. "Her? That's just Clara. My eldest. She just does the books." "She does the books," Dante repeated softly. He took one slow, measured step toward Clara's desk. He loomed over her, his imposing shadow swallowing her completely. And he studied her the way no one in that family ever had. "You hid $4 million from my top accountants for 6 months," he said. Did you orchestrate that, Clara? Clara swallowed hard. She refused to look away. A spark of stubborn defiance flared in her chest, something she hadn't felt in years. I only masked the discrepancies, she said, her voice shaking but clear. My father made the transfers. I just kept your auditors from seeing the bleeding. Dante stared at her. Not with the familiar lazy repulsion she received from her family. He looked at her the way someone looks at a locked safe they're already calculating how to open. I don't need a vapid trophy, Dante declared, his eyes never once leaving Clara's face. I need loyalty. And I need a brain. He straightened. I'll take this one. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Savannah, who had been hovering tearfully in the hallway, burst into the room, forgetting the danger entirely in her disbelief. You want Clara? Savannah shrieked. But she's a whale, she's discussed. The temperature in the room plummeted. Dante didn't yell. He merely turned his head toward Savannah. His expression deadened into something monstrous. Cut out her tongue, he ordered his men casually. As though commenting on the weather. No! Clara screamed. She bolted up from her chair. Her thighs hit the heavy desk, shoving it forward with a loud screech of metal against linoleum. She put herself, her full, soft body, directly between Dante's enforcers and her family. No, please. I'll go. I'll marry you. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt them. Dante raised one gloved hand. The enforcers stopped. He turned back to Clara. He studied the way her chest heaved. The way she had instinctively shielded the very people who had just tried to throw her away. Pack a bag, Clara Higgins, Dante said quietly. You are now a Rossetti. And if your father or your sister ever speak your name with disrespect again, his eyes swept the room one final time, I will burn this entire bloodline to ash. The wedding was a sterile, chilling affair held 48 hours later in a private, dimly lit Catholic cathedral. Clara stood at the altar in a rushed, ill-fitting white dress that dug painfully into her waist, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Dante slipped a massive, flawless diamond onto her finger. His hands were warm, calloused, and shockingly gentle. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Clara stared at the cold marble floor. She belonged to a monster now. A ruthless, sterile king who had taken her to punish her father and exploit her mind. She expected a life of dark, agonizing misery. She had absolutely no idea the true danger was only just beginning. The Rossetti estate was a sprawling, fortress-like mansion on the edge of Lake Michigan. For the first 2 weeks of her marriage, Clara lived like a ghost haunting its opulent halls. She had a massive suite entirely to herself, separate from Dante's quarters. The Mafia boss was a phantom, leaving before she woke and returning long after she had cried herself to sleep. Clara expected cruelty from his staff. Instead, she was met with a bizarre, rigid respect. Dante's right-hand man, Leo Rossi, a scarred, fiercely loyal enforcer, addressed her strictly as Donna Clara, bowing his head whenever she entered a room. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday. Clara, bored out of her mind and desperate for purpose, had wandered into Dante's private study. She found a stack of completely disorganized shipping manifests and, unable to help herself, began color-coding and auditing them with the focused intensity of someone who had been starved of meaningful work. When Dante returned home at 2 a.m, he found his new wife asleep at his mahogany desk, her cheek pillowed on an open leather ledger. He didn't wake her. Clara woke up the next morning tucked securely into her own bed, a heavy dark cashmere blanket draped carefully over her. That evening, Dante commanded she join him for dinner. They sat at opposite ends of a long dining table. Clara picked nervously at her roasted chicken, terribly self-conscious of her appetite under his intense gaze. You found the error in the doc's payroll, Dante said, taking a slow sip of red wine. The foreman was skimming, Clara replied quietly, eyes on her plate. About 8%. It was disguised as equipment maintenance. My men missed it. Your men look for guns and enemies, mister. Rossetti. They don't look at decimal points. Dante, he corrected her. He set the glass down. My name is Dante. And you are my wife. His voice shifted, steady and deliberate. You will not eat like a frightened bird in my presence, Clara. Eat what you want. Be who you are. Clara looked up, startled. My family, she hesitated, wrapping her arms around her stomach defensively. My father always said a woman's worth is measured by the space she doesn't take up. She paused. I know I am not what a man like you desires. Dante stood up. He walked the entire length of the table, pulled out the chair directly beside hers, and sat down. He was so close she could smell his cologne, cedar, smoke, and bergamot. He reached out. His knuckles brushed gently against her flushed cheek. Your father is a fool who measures worth in starved bones and stolen money, Dante murmured, his voice dropping an octave. I chose you, Clara, because there is substance to you. Brilliance. Warmth. He held her gaze. Do not ever apologize for the space you take up in my house. Something fundamental shifted in Clara that night. The heavy, suffocating armor she had worn her entire life began, slowly, quietly, to crack. Dante backed up his words with actions. He hired a tailor specializing in plus-size fashion to fill her closet with exquisite silks, tailored blazers, and gorgeous gowns that hugged her curves rather than hiding them. He brought her into his inner circle, relying on her sharp mathematical mind to quietly, brilliantly streamline his empire. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the terrifying Mafia boss became simply Dante. The physical wall between them broke 3 months into the marriage. Dante returned from a sit-down with the Irish mob that had gone catastrophically wrong. He walked into her bedroom, his white shirt soaked in blood from a deep laceration across his ribs. Clara didn't scream. With terrifying calm, she guided him to the bathroom, stripped off his ruined shirt, and carefully cleaned and stitched the wound using the medical kit Leo had shown her weeks earlier. Dante sat on the edge of the tub and watched her. His eyes tracked the soft curve of her jaw, the intense focus in her dark eyes, the quiet confidence in hands that didn't shake. You're not afraid of the blood, he rasped, his hand rising to rest on the curve of her hip. I'm afraid of losing the only person who has ever truly seen me, Clara whispered, tying off the suture. Dante pulled her down. His mouth crashed into hers, desperate and consuming. A kiss fueled by adrenaline and months of repressed, simmering tension. He carried her to the bed, treating her body not as something to be tolerated, but as something to be reverently, completely worshipped. He mapped every soft curve, every inch of her skin with a fiery, focused obsession, whispering words into her skin that dismantled the last of her insecurities one by one. For the next 2 months, Clara was genuinely, surprisingly happy. The forced marriage had blossomed into something fierce and deeply protective. She was the undisputed queen of the Rossetti Empire, ruling the books while her husband ruled the streets. Then the exhaustion started. Clara chalked it up to late nights auditing. But the exhaustion morphed into strange aversions. The smell of Dante's morning espresso made her stomach churn violently. Her waistline felt impossibly bloated. And her body, already lush and full, felt somehow different in a way she couldn't name. It came to a disastrous head during the syndicate's quarterly gathering. 40 of the most dangerous men in the Midwest were seated at the banquet hall of the Rossetti estate. Among them was Matteo, Dante's snake-like, ambitious cousin, who had spent years quietly positioning himself to inherit the family. Banking entirely on the medical certainty that Dante could never produce an heir. Clara sat at Dante's right hand in a deep crimson gown. The servers brought out the main course. The moment the silver cloche was lifted, a wave of rich, heavily seasoned roasted lamb hit her like a physical blow. The color drained from her face. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her chair scraping violently backward as she bolted from the table. She barely made it to the adjoining powder room. The banquet hall fell completely silent. Dante abandoned the table instantly, rushing after her. He found Clara kneeling on the tile floor, gasping, trembling violently. Leo! Dante roared over his shoulder. Get Dr. Gallagher. Now. 10 minutes later, Clara lay on a plush sofa in Dante's private office, a cool cloth on her forehead. Dr. Eris Gallagher, the syndicate's deeply trusted physician, was taking her pulse and asking a series of quiet, pointed questions. When was her last cycle? Was she experiencing tenderness, dizziness? The heavy oak doors were open. Matteo and several top capos lingered in the hallway, their faces masks of grim curiosity. Dr. Gallagher packed his stethoscope slowly into his leather bag. He stood, looking from Clara to Dante. He cleared his throat. Well? Dante demanded. What's wrong with her? A bug? Poison? Neither, Dr. Gallagher said, his voice trembling slightly. He looked at Clara with a mixture of awe and profound discomfort. Donna Clara is perfectly healthy. She is experiencing hyperemesis gravidarum. He paused. Severe morning sickness. The room stopped breathing. She is pregnant, the doctor confirmed softly. Approximately 10 weeks along. Clara's hand flew to her stomach, a gasp of pure shock escaping her lips. Pregnant. But that was impossible. The entire underworld knew it was medically, categorically impossible. From the hallway, Matteo stepped forward. A nasty, triumphant sneer twisted his features as he looked from Clara to his cousin. Pregnant, Matteo laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed off the walls. Well. Isn't that a miracle? Seeing as we all know you're shooting blanks, Don. He tilted his head at Clara. Tell me, who's the father? Because a woman who brings bastard blood into the Rossetti family doesn't get a divorce. He let the word land like a blade. She gets a bullet. Dante slowly turned his head. His eyes were devoid of all human emotion. Clara watched in paralyzed terror as the man she loved looked at her, not with the warmth of the past few months, but with the chilling, calculating suspicion of a betrayed Mafia king. The silence in the room was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. Clara looked up at him silently, begging the man who had whispered her name like a prayer just hours ago to see her now. Dante's hand moved with lightning speed. He didn't reach for Clara. He drew his custom Glock 19 and pressed the barrel directly between Matteo's eyes. Say another word about my wife, Dante whispered, his voice a lethal, vibrating rasp, and I will paint this mahogany floor with your brains. Matteo swallowed hard, raising his hands in mock surrender, though the sinister smirk never fully left his lips. I'm only protecting family honor, Don. You know the medical records. Dr. Arieta confirmed it 10 years ago. It is medically impossible for you to father a child. He paused, letting the implication fill the room. If she's pregnant, she's a traitor. And you know the penalty for treason. Dante kept the gun leveled at his cousin's skull. Get out, he said. All of you. Now. The capos scrambled. They dragged a reluctant Matteo with them. Dr. Gallagher quietly packed his bag and slipped out, offering Clara one last sorrowful glance before closing the heavy double doors behind him. Clara was left alone with the monster. Dante holstered his weapon and turned to her. He didn't shout. He didn't strike her. The absolute void in his expression was infinitely worse than either. Dante, Clara choked out, pushing herself up from the sofa. Her legs trembled beneath her. Dom, please. Look at me, I have never been with another man. I didn't even know how to be loved until you touched me. You took my virginity. You know this child is yours. I know, Dante said. His voice was hollow. Fractured. But I had my reproductive organs systematically destroyed by the Calibers cartel in a basement in Sicily. I know that, Dr. Vincent Arieta, a specialist flown in from Johns Hopkins, operated on me for 14 hours and told me the damage was irreparable. He held her gaze. I know I am sterile, Clara. And yet you are carrying my child. I don't care what that doctor said 10 years ago, Clara cried out, wrapping her arms protectively over her stomach. I am not my father. I am not a liar. Dante closed his eyes. The muscle in his jaw feathered. When he opened them, the dawn had fully overridden the husband. Lock down the east wing, he commanded Leo Rossi, who had silently slipped back into the room. Donna Clara is not to leave her suite. No phones. No internet. No visitors. Dante, you can't. Until I have absolute proof, he interrupted, his voice breaking just a fraction, betraying the agony churning beneath the ice. Until a paternity test is conducted and verified by an independent laboratory, you are a prisoner in this house, Clara. He met her eyes one final time. If the child is mine, I will spend the rest of my life begging for your forgiveness. If it is not, he paused, I will handle it myself. For the next 10 days, Clara lived in gilded solitary confinement. The opulent East Wing felt like a tomb. She was fed the finest meals, carefully curated by Dr. Gallagher to support her pregnancy, but she ate them in total, echoing silence. She paced the thick carpets for hours, her hands resting on the soft curve of her belly, whispering quiet promises of survival to the tiny life growing inside her. She refused to wear the baggy, concealing clothes she had arrived in. Instead, she dressed every morning in her tailored silk robes, the ones Dante had ordered for her, the ones that draped her curves instead of hiding them. She was a Rossetti queen. She would not cower in her own room. Downstairs, the syndicate was bleeding. Matteo was quietly rallying the capos, using Clara's pregnancy as proof that Dante had grown weak, blinded by a fat, treacherous accountant. He was calling for a tribunal. Positioning himself for the throne the moment Clara's guilt was declared. But Dante wasn't simply waiting for a medical result. He had unleashed Harrison Cole, a ruthless private investigator and former MI6 operative, to dig into the past. And Dante's gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive in the underworld for 15 years, kept telling him the same thing. Clara was innocent. And if Clara was innocent, then the history Dante had been forced to swallow a decade ago was a lie. On the 11th night, a fierce thunderstorm battered the Chicago coastline. Clara was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the heavy oak door of her suite clicked open. It wasn't Leo. It wasn't Dante. 3 men in black tactical gear stepped into the room, wielding silenced pistols. Matteo sends his regards, the lead assassin hissed, raising his weapon. Clara didn't scream. With a surge of pure maternal adrenaline, she rolled her heavy body off the mattress, hitting the floor just as a suppressed bullet tore through her pillow where her head had been. She used her powerful legs to kick the solid oak bedside table backward with everything she had, slamming it into the assassin's knees. The man howled, his shot going wide and shattering the mirrored vanity. Clara scrambled toward the panic room concealed behind the walk-in closet, her bare feet slipping on the silk rugs. Another man lunged. His hand grabbed a fistful of her thick curly hair. Before he could yank her backward, the bedroom doors were blown clean off their hinges. Dante Rossetti entered the room like a god of war. He didn't bother with words. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The man holding Clara's hair dropped dead instantly, a neat hole between his eyes. The second assassin barely had time to turn before Leo Rossi materialized from the corridor, driving a combat knife through the man's ribs with surgical precision. The third, pinned under the overturned bedside table, scrambled for his weapon. Dante walked over to him with terrifying calm and crushed the man's wrist beneath the heel of his Italian leather boot. Clara sat trembling on the floor, her breathing ragged. Dante dropped his weapon and fell to his knees beside her. His hands moved frantically across her arms, her shoulders, her face, checking for wounds with a desperation completely stripped of all his carefully constructed armor. "I'm okay," Clara sobbed, collapsing into his chest. "I'm okay. The baby is okay." Dante buried his face in her neck, his massive frame shaking in a way she had never once seen from him. "I've got you," he whispered fiercely. "I've got you, my queen. I'm so sorry." She pulled back to look at his face. The test? Dante reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled, blood-spattered envelope bearing the seal of a private genetics laboratory in Geneva. His hands weren't entirely steady as he opened it. Probability of paternity 99.9%. His voice cracked. He pressed his forehead against hers. He's mine, Clara. He's my son. She let out a choked cry of pure, exhausted relief, her hands gripping his shirt. But how? The doctors were bought. Dante's eyes ignited with a cold, lethal fire. That's how. An hour later, the grand foyer of the Rossetti estate had been transformed into something that looked very much like a reckoning. Matteo had been dragged from his penthouse and thrown onto the marble floor, surrounded by 50 armed loyalists. Dante stood at the top of the grand staircase. Clara stood at his side, wearing a deep emerald velvet robe, her full, magnificent figure radiating an undeniable regal authority. Harrison Cole stepped forward and tossed a thick dossier at Matteo's bleeding face. Dr. Vincent Arrieta, Harrison announced to the room, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. 10 years ago, he performed surgery on Don Rossetti. The injuries were severe but not permanent. With time and natural healing, fertility was fully possible. A pause. But Dr. Arrieta never told Dante that. He falsified every medical record to show total, permanent sterility. A murmur of shock rippled through the gathered soldiers. Why? Dante asked softly, descending the stairs like a stalking panther. Because your father paid him $3 million to do it. Dante's voice carried through the entire foyer with devastating precision. Your father wanted the throne, Matteo. But he died before he could take it. So the ambition passed to you. You knew that if I believed I was sterile, I would never try for an heir. You knew the syndicate would eventually fall to you. He reached the bottom of the stairs. You've been waiting a decade for me to die without a son. Matteo spat blood onto the marble. You're a crippled fool, Don. And she's a fat, pathetic accountant your father-in-law threw in the garbage. Neither of you deserve this empire. Dante didn't blink. He drew his Glock. She is Donna Rossetti, he said simply. The mother of my heir. And the woman who saved my soul. He pulled the trigger. Matteo's body slumped to the marble floor. The room fell deathly silent. Then, one by one in the capos, the soldiers, and the enforcers dropped to their knees. They bowed their heads. Not just to the brutal, undisputed Dawn of Chicago, but to the magnificent, brilliant woman standing at the top of the stairs, her hand resting protectively over the future of the entire Rossetti empire. 6 months later, the estate was bathed in warm golden spring sunlight. Clara sat on the terrace overlooking Lake Michigan, reviewing the syndicate's offshore accounts on her tablet. Her stomach was beautifully, gloriously round, resting heavily in her lap. She had never felt more beautiful, more powerful, or more completely loved. Footsteps sounded behind her. Dante leaned over the back of her chair and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her cheek. His large hands came to rest reverently over her pregnant belly. Take a break, Donna Clara, he murmured, his voice thick with quiet adoration. The empire can wait. Our son is kicking. Clara smiled and leaned back into the solid warmth of her husband's chest. She had been sold as a punishment. Discarded because of her size. Thrown into a world full of monsters. But she had tamed the devil, exposed a decade-long treason, and built a kingdom in a place where she was finally, undeniably seen. Not despite who she was. Because of it.